On my birthday, I thought my son had finally remembered me. A box arrived at my doorstep, neatly wrapped with a card that read, "Happy Birthday, Dad." Inside was a bottle of whiskey. Now I don't drink anymore, not since my heart problems, but I smiled anyway. At least he thought of me. The next day, the phone rang. It was my son. His voice was calm, too calm. "Dad," he asked, "so how was the whiskey?" I laughed and told him, "Oh, I actually gave it to your father-in-law. He loves the good stuff." Silence. For a long second, I thought the line had dropped. Then came the sound I'll never forget. He screamed, "You did what?" My hand went cold. My stomach dropped. Why would he react like that, unless that bottle wasn't meant to be enjoyed? That single moment changed everything. What was supposed to be a simple birthday gift spiraled into a nightmare of betrayal, secrets, and a ruthless plan I never saw coming. And as I uncovered piece after piece of the truth, I realized something horrifying. The gift wasn't meant to celebrate my life, it was meant to end it. So now I ask you, what kind of son sends his father a bottle of whiskey with a secret inside that could kill? And what happens when that plan backfires in the worst way imaginable? Would you have seen it coming? Richard Walker was 62 years old, a retired contractor who had built homes for other families, but now lived alone in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. His days were slow, predictable, and often lonely since the divorce from Linda nearly a decade ago. The neighbors knew him as the man who tended his lawn early in the morning, waved politely, but rarely invited anyone inside. He had grown used to the silence of his house, though on nights when the wind rattled the windows, he admitted to himself that silence could feel like punishment. His birthday came in late autumn, a season when the trees turned brittle and gold, and Richard often felt the weight of time pressing harder on his shoulders. He hadn't expected much. Maybe a call from Linda out of courtesy, or a card from a distant cousin. He did not expect anything from his son Daniel. They had grown apart over the years. Arguments after the divorce had carved a canyon between them, and Daniel had built a life of his own that seemed to exclude his father entirely. So when Richard found a package waiting on his front porch that morning, neatly wrapped and stamped with his son's name, he paused as though the box itself might vanish if he looked too long. Inside was a bottle of whiskey, gleaming amber through polished glass, the kind sold behind counters in expensive shops. Richard held it carefully, running a finger across the label, and for a fleeting moment he allowed himself to believe Daniel had remembered him with warmth. But reality returned quickly. He hadn't touched alcohol in years, not since a cardiologist warned him it might push his failing heart past its limits. Whiskey meant nothing to him now except temptation and risk. He placed the bottle on the counter, stepped back, and studied it as though it were a puzzle he had no interest in solving. Still, a gift was a gift. He thought of Henry Miller, Daniel's father-in-law. A man with a taste for fine liquor and a laugh that always boomed too loud across the dinner table. Richard had never been close to Henry, but he knew enough to be polite. And so he decided Henry could enjoy this whiskey more than he ever could. With that simple decision, Richard believed he had solved a small problem, unaware he had just opened a door into something far darker. The next day his phone rang. He answered, hearing Daniel's voice, calm, almost rehearsed. "Dad," Daniel said so. "How was the whiskey?" Richard gave a short laugh. "Oh, I don't drink these days." I passed it on to Henry. "He loves a good bottle." On the other end, silence spread like frost across glass. Richard frowned, checked the line, wondered if the call had dropped. Then all at once, Daniel's voice broke through, sharp as shattered metal. "You did what?" The force of it struck Richard in the chest. He pulled the phone back, stared at it, then brought it to his ear again. His son was breathing heavily, not the calm tone of a man checking on a thoughtful gift, but the fury of someone whose plan had just twisted off course. Richard tried to brush it off, to pretend he hadn't heard what he just heard, but the words echoed in his head long after the call ended. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the whiskey's empty place on the counter, remembering the momentary pride he felt when he thought Daniel had remembered him with kindness. That pride now curdled into confusion. What sort of gift could make a man freeze in silence? What hidden meaning could sit behind a simple bottle of whiskey? Gifts, Richard thought, are supposed to heal old wounds, not rip them open wider. Yet his son's reaction had the violence of betrayal. He sat there, the phone still in his hand, trying to steady his breath. The yard outside was quiet, the last of the leaves scratching across the driveway, the kind of day when nothing should feel dangerous. But in his chest, unease had begun to rise. Daniel's scream had split open something that could not be ignored. As evening settled in, Richard poured himself a glass of water, sat back down, and stared at the phone again. He replayed the moment in his mind, the silence, then the scream. He knew Daniel's temper, but this was different. This was fear disguised as rage. He whispered aloud to the empty kitchen, "I thought it was just a gift, but gifts don't make a man scream like that." The bottle was gone, passed into Henry's hands, and Richard could not take it back. He wondered uneasily what Henry might be doing with it right now. Somewhere in his gut a thought stirred that chilled him more than the autumn wind. Maybe that whiskey was never meant to be enjoyed at all. And if that was true, then Henry was in danger already. Would Henry call him tomorrow laughing about the bottle, or would Richard's phone ring with news he dreaded? That question hovered like a storm cloud, and Richard knew he would not sleep easy that night. Richard barely slept that night, the echo of Daniel's scream rattling around in his head like a stone in an empty jar. Morning came gray and damp, and the first chill of winter clung to the air. He tried to distract himself with small chores, sweeping the porch, tightening a loose hinge. But the unease never left his chest. The whiskey was no longer in his house, and that thought haunted him. Henry had it now. He told himself Henry would probably open the bottle, pour a glass, and laugh about it later. Yet beneath that fragile hope lived a gnawing dread. That afternoon, Henry hosted a small family supper at his home. Richard was invited out of courtesy, and though he hesitated, he decided to go. It would be better, he thought, to see with his own eyes. When he arrived, the Millers' dining room glowed warm with candlelight and the smells of roast chicken and potatoes. Relatives filled the seats, voices overlapping in cheerful chatter. On the sideboard, in clear view, stood the whiskey bottle Richard had passed along, its amber liquid catching the light like trapped fire. He swallowed hard, the sight of it tightening the knot in his stomach. Henry, jovial as ever, raised the bottle with a grin. "Richard, you really outdid yourself," he said, assuming the gift had come directly from him. "This is top-shelf stuff." He poured generous glasses for himself and a few others who appreciated a strong drink. Richard forced a smile, his hands cold against the wood of his chair. He watched Henry lift the glass toast to family and drink deeply. The sound of laughter filled the room, but for Richard, every clink of glass was a hammer pounding his nerves. For a while, nothing happened. Conversation drifted easily from politics to neighborhood gossip, and Richard began to wonder if perhaps he had overreacted to Daniel's outburst. Maybe he was just imagining shadows where there were none. But as the evening wore on, Henry's face grew pale. His laughter faltered, his hand trembled as he set the glass down. A bead of sweat traced his temple, and then his body bent with a sudden spasm of pain. The room erupted in chaos. Henry clutched his stomach, his chair crashing backward as he crumpled to the floor. Plates shattered, people screamed. Someone shouted to call 911. Richard stood frozen. His breath caught in his throat while others rushed to Henry's side. In that instant, every eye turned toward him, the man who had brought the bottle. A cousin pointed an accusing finger. "That whiskey came from you, Richard. You brought it here." The words landed heavy, slicing through the din like a blade. Richard stammered, tried to explain that Daniel had sent it first. But the faces around him were tight with suspicion. They didn't see nuance. They saw a man connected to the poisoned glass lying on the floor. The paramedics arrived swiftly, lifting Henry onto a stretcher, his groans filling the night air as they carried him out. Richard followed into the hallway, but one of the relatives blocked his path with a glare cold enough to burn. "If Henry doesn't make it," the man said flatly, "it's on you." The sentence slammed into Richard harder than any fist. At the hospital, sterile lights and the smell of antiseptic closed in around him. Richard sat in the waiting area, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. Doctors rushed past, nurses murmured, but no one gave him answers. Time stretched like an endless corridor. He kept replaying the moment Daniel had screamed over the phone and the way Henry collapsed after that single glass. The two memories fused into a single truth that chilled him. The whiskey was not a gift of celebration, but a weapon. Family members filtered in, some whispering, others throwing him glances thick with blame. Richard tried to defend himself, but his words fell into silence. They did not want explanations, they wanted someone to hold accountable. He felt the walls close in, not just the hospital walls, but the walls of suspicion pressing in from every side. When a doctor finally emerged, his expression grave, he said, "Henry was stable but in critical condition. Poisoning was suspected, tests would confirm." Richard nodded, though inside he was unraveling. The doctor's words confirmed what his gut already knew. But instead of relief, a deeper fear coiled within him. Henry might survive, but the question would remain, who had put the poison in that bottle? And why was Richard the one left standing in the crossfire of accusation as the family huddled together down the hallway? Richard sat apart, a solitary figure in a chair too hard beneath lights too bright. He thought of Daniel's voice again. That scream of rage, the sound of a plan unraveling. If the whiskey was meant for Henry, why had Daniel panicked when Richard gave it away? And if it was meant for him, then Henry's collapse was a cruel accident in someone else's ruthless design. The questions circled endlessly until one thought anchored itself with terrifying clarity. This was no misunderstanding. It was intent. Someone had tried to turn his birthday into his death day, and that someone was far closer to him than any stranger could ever be. In the quiet of the hospital corridor, Richard clenched his fists. He was not just a victim of suspicion, he was a man marked, and if he did nothing, the next glass might not miss its target. The night ended with Henry lying in a hospital bed and Richard walking into the cold air outside, every breath burning with the weight of accusation. He looked back at the lit windows of the hospital, then down at his trembling hands. The battle had only just begun, and somewhere in the shadows the truth waited to be uncovered. But who else had drunk from that bottle, and would another call come before morning? That was the fear that gripped him as he started his car and drove into the dark. The taste of betrayal already sour in his mouth. Richard left the hospital with his coat pulled tight against the night air, but no amount of fabric could shield him from the chill creeping through his bones. The look on his relatives' faces, the accusation in their eyes, stayed with him long after Henry was wheeled into intensive care. The words, "If Henry doesn't make it, it's on you," rang like a curse. He drove home in silence, the empty passenger seat a reminder of the bottle that had sparked this chaos. The whiskey was no longer a simple gift. It had become evidence, and evidence could condemn or exonerate him. The following morning, after a restless night, Richard returned to the hospital. He asked about Henry's condition and was told the man remained critical but stable. Then Richard pressed for the bottle. It had been collected with Henry's belongings after the paramedics brought him in. Nurses hesitated, skeptical, but finally handed him the half-drained bottle in a sealed bag. Richard accepted it with a heavy heart. He held it as though it might explode, its amber liquid now sinister instead of inviting. He didn't trust the authorities to act quickly. Families at odds rarely found sympathy in small-town police departments. If he wanted answers, he would have to find them himself. There was only one person he could trust: Alan Morris, an old friend from his contracting days. Alan had retired from law enforcement after 30 years as a forensic technician. Now he did occasional consulting work from a modest lab he set up in his garage, a place filled with microscopes, testing kits, and the smell of chemicals that never quite left his clothes. Richard called him, his voice low and urgent, and Alan agreed to see him that afternoon. When Richard arrived, Alan raised a brow at the sealed bag. "What's this?" he asked, already sensing trouble. Richard's voice shook as he explained. "It was a birthday gift from Daniel. I gave it to Henry. He drank it last night, collapsed, nearly died. I need to know if it's clean or if it's what I fear." Alan led him into the garage. The space was cluttered but organized, every tool in its place, every surface gleaming from regular use. Richard placed the bottle on a metal table, its amber glow dim under the fluorescent light. Alan put on gloves, opened his kit, and poured a sample into a vial. The process was deliberate, precise, and each click of a tool made Richard's chest tighten. As Alan worked, Richard's thoughts spiraled. He remembered the sound of Daniel's voice over the phone, calm, too calm until it wasn't. He remembered the silence before the scream, the kind of silence that hides fear. A father should never doubt his son, but here he was, waiting for proof that Daniel's gift carried death in its glass belly. He clenched his fists, nails biting his palms, fighting the wave of anger and sorrow that surged with every heartbeat. Alan finally turned to him. "Initial tests won't tell us everything, but I can check for toxins. If there's something dangerous here, we'll see traces." He inserted the sample into a small machine, the hum filling the room. Minutes stretched into eternities. Richard paced, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. Each tick of the clock echoed the thud of his heart. Then the machine beeped. Alan leaned over, squinting at the small display. His expression shifted from concentration to something darker, heavier. Richard stopped pacing, his throat dry. "What is it?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Alan exhaled slowly. "There are traces of organophosphates. Not much, but enough. This isn't something you'd find in a sealed, legitimate bottle. This was tampered with." He held up the vial like a shard of damning truth. "Richard, this wasn't an accident. It was intent." The words struck like a hammer. Richard gripped the edge of the table, steadying himself against the surge of nausea and rage. His mind reeled with images: Henry gasping for air, his relatives glaring, Daniel's scream when he realized the bottle had gone elsewhere. The pieces clicked together into a picture more horrifying than anything he had imagined. For a moment, Richard could barely breathe. Betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was in his hands, sealed in glass. Someone had wanted him gone, and they had used his birthday of all days to deliver the weapon. He thought of Linda, of the years lost, of the distance between him and Daniel. And now this, to be hunted by his own blood. Alan watched him carefully. "You need to take this to the authorities. Poisoning like this, it's attempted murder." Richard shook his head. "Not yet. Not until I know why. If I go now, they'll think it's just family drama. They won't see the truth. They'll think it's me." His voice hardened, steel cutting through despair. "No, I'll get the truth first, then I'll show them." Alan hesitated but did not argue. He handed Richard back the bottle, resealed in its bag. "Be careful. Whoever did this, they won't stop if they think they've failed." Richard left the lab with the weight of the bottle heavy in his hands. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and in each shadow Richard felt the shape of betrayal looming. He had confirmation now. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't imagining. The whiskey was a weapon crafted and placed with purpose. As he slid into his truck and set the bottle carefully on the passenger seat, Richard whispered into the silence, "Daniel, what have you done?" The road stretched ahead, endless and uncertain, but Richard knew one thing with brutal clarity: this fight was no longer about suspicion. It was about survival. In the distance, his phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen, and the sender's name froze his breath. It was Daniel, and the words glowed like a threat across the display. "Dad, we need to talk. Now." Richard drove home from Alan's garage with the sealed bottle beside him. Daniel's message still glowing on the phone screen. The words gnawed at him. "Dad, we need to talk. Now." He parked in his driveway and sat in silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. He couldn't bring himself to answer, not yet. The weight of truth pressed too heavily. His son's gift wasn't a gesture of love, it was a loaded gun disguised as kindness. The thought was unbearable, and yet, as much as he wanted to dismiss it, the evidence was there in that poisoned glass. Inside the house, Richard sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once helped Daniel with schoolwork decades ago. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as glass. Daniel had been 9 years old then, stubborn and restless. After the divorce, every evening was a battle. Richard remembered the boy glaring at him over math problems, muttering that Mom's way was better, Mom's house was easier. A wound had opened early, and Richard hadn't known how to close it. The silence between them had stretched across years until the bond of father and son felt like a frayed rope ready to snap. He rubbed his temples and leaned back, letting the years flood him. Daniel had never forgiven him for the separation. When Linda won custody, Richard became the weekend father, the afterthought. He remembered birthdays where Daniel refused to blow out candles with him, holidays where the boy clung to Linda's side, refusing his father's hand. Resentment had been planted young, watered by absence and nourished by bitterness. Perhaps it had grown into something more poisonous than Richard had ever dared to imagine. Another memory surfaced, one more recent. A family barbecue at Henry Miller's house years before everything fell apart. Richard had stood awkwardly at the edge of the yard holding a plate when Henry's booming voice cut through the chatter. Henry had scolded Daniel for failing at some minor task, his voice sharp with ridicule. "You'll never be half the man your father is," Henry barked. The crowd had gone silent, and Daniel's face flushed crimson. Richard had wanted to defend his son to ease the sting, but he had stood frozen, unsure if he even deserved the compliment. Daniel's eyes, wide with shame and fury, had flicked from Henry to Richard, and in them Richard had seen something dangerous ignite. That moment had lodged itself like a thorn never pulled out. Now, sitting in the dim light of his kitchen, Richard pieced the memories together. Daniel's resentment toward him, Henry's humiliation of him, the debts Daniel had accumulated, the poisoned whiskey that almost killed Henry. Was Daniel aiming at his father or at his father-in-law? And if the bottle had reached the wrong lips, what did that mean for the rest of them? The questions circled like vultures. Richard whispered aloud, the words tasting bitter. Could my own son want me dead? His voice cracked in the quiet. The thought pierced deeper than any accusation from his relatives, deeper than the cold looks at the hospital. Blood was supposed to be the shield against the world, the bond that held through storm and trial. Yet here he was, staring at the possibility that his own blood had become the sharpest knife aimed at his heart. He rose and paced the living room, staring at old photographs on the mantel. One showed Daniel at 10, standing in a baseball uniform too big for him, Richard's hand resting awkwardly on his shoulder. Another from high school graduation, Linda standing proudly beside Daniel while Richard stood off to the side, a smile that never reached his eyes. Each image now felt like evidence in a case he wished he didn't have to argue, proof that distance and resentment had calcified into something lethal. The injustice of it burned. He had worked all his life, saved what he could, built a modest nest egg so his family wouldn't want. Now he wondered if that legacy had become a curse, if the very security he had bled for had tempted his son into betrayal. It was an insult worse than poverty. It was being turned into prey by the one person meant to carry his name forward. Richard slumped into his recliner, staring into the darkened window where his own reflection looked back at him. The man he saw there was older, wearier, but beneath the lines and gray hair burned a rising fire. If this was truly Daniel's doing, then Richard could not sit idle. Love might once have stayed his hand, but betrayal demanded a reckoning. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel, more insistent this time. "Dad, pick up. We need to fix this." Richard's heart thudded. Fix what? Fix the fact that Henry lay in a hospital bed. Fix the poison sitting in a sealed bottle on his table. Fix the hollow chasm between father and son that had widened into attempted murder. Richard's fingers hovered over the phone, trembling with both fury and despair. The room felt heavy with ghosts. The ghost of the boy Daniel once was the ghost of the father Richard had failed to be, and the ghost of a family shattered long ago. He set the phone down and whispered into the silence. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Sometimes it's the sharpest knife. The truth tasted like ash. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and Richard shivered. He could almost hear footsteps on the porch, though he knew no one was there. Paranoia had settled in heavy as fog. He turned off the lights, the house sinking into darkness, and sat waiting, the bottle glinting faintly on the table. But as the night stretched on, one thought clawed louder than the rest. If Daniel had gone this far once, he would try again. And next time, Richard feared the plan might not miss its mark. The night after, Richard whispered to himself that blood could cut like a knife. He sat restless in his chair, staring at the sealed bottle on his table. Sleep would not come, only the sound of his own thoughts circling like wolves. One truth gnawed louder than the rest. If Daniel had truly meant to poison him, there had to be a reason beyond anger or pride. Men did not risk prison and damnation for nothing. Men killed for money, for survival, for debt. And so Richard resolved to find out what his son might gain if his father was gone. The next morning, he drove to the office of Charles Whitman, his longtime attorney. Charles was a gray-haired man in his 70s who had handled Richard's will and insurance matters since the divorce. Richard trusted him in ways he trusted very few. The office was lined with heavy shelves of legal books, the kind that gave the air of permanence and gravity. Charles looked up from his desk, surprised to see Richard without an appointment, but waved him in. Richard's voice was firm but low. "Charles, I need to see my insurance and estate papers, all of them, every detail." Charles blinked, then reached for a file cabinet. He pulled out a thick folder and laid it on the desk. Richard opened it with hands that trembled slightly, flipping through the pages until his eyes froze on a single line: beneficiary Daniel Walker. His heart hammered. The policy was valued at over $2 million. If Richard died, Daniel would inherit it all alongside the house and remaining savings. Richard's throat tightened as if a rope had cinched around it. His son would gain more in his death than in all the years of strained living between them. Charles spoke gently, perhaps sensing the storm inside his client. "You set this up years ago, Richard. Back then it seemed right. He was your only son. Who else would you leave it to?" Richard stared at the name, his lips pressed thin. He barely heard the explanation. All he could see was the chain of events, a bottle arriving at his doorstep, poison swirling in a glass, Daniel screaming when the plan went awry. And now this, the clear motive written in ink waiting in a drawer all along. Richard muttered almost to himself, my death was supposed to pay his debts. Charles leaned forward. What debts? Richard shook his head, the words spilling bitterly. I've heard things. Daniel owes money to dangerous people. He's drowning. And now I know what he thought would be the lifeboat. Later that day, Richard stopped at a diner on the edge of town. There he ran into a man he knew only in passing, a neighbor of Henry's. Over coffee, the man leaned closer and said in a lowered voice, You didn't hear it from me, but Daniel's been talking loose. Told someone the other night, when my old man goes, everything will be fine. Richard felt his stomach drop. The gossip confirmed what the papers had already told him. Daniel was desperate enough to see his father's death as salvation. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Each mile felt heavier, as though the road itself pressed against him with accusation. Back at the house, Richard spread the papers across his kitchen table. The numbers stared up at him like a cruel truth, 2 million reasons for Daniel to want him gone. He thought of all the nights he had gone without so Daniel could have more, all the weekends spent working extra jobs when he should have been at baseball games or school recitals. He had sacrificed believing it was for his son's future. Now that very sacrifice had become the bait for betrayal. The injustice of it twisted in his gut. He clenched the papers in his fists, crumpling the edges, rage flickering like a storm inside him. It was not just about money. It was about being reduced to a dollar amount, about love and fatherhood being measured against insurance payouts. His own blood had turned him into a ledger entry, a means to an end. That night he stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The man who stared back was no longer simply a father or a victim. He was a target, and a target who would not go quietly. His voice cracked as he whispered to the empty house, If he thinks I'll die for his debts, he's wrong. Yet beneath the anger lay sorrow, a grief so deep it hollowed his chest. For even if he survived this, what remained of father and son? Could there ever be reconciliation when the motive was this clear, this cold? The phone rang, then jolting him from his thoughts. It was Linda. Her voice trembled. Richard, we need to talk. There's something about Daniel you don't know. Richard froze, the papers still clenched in his hand. Her words promised revelations he feared and yet needed. The storm was far from over. It was only beginning, and the next wave was already on its way. Richard drove away from Charles's office with the weight of the insurance papers pressing down on him like a stone. The numbers, the signatures, the ink that made Daniel his beneficiary, it all swirled in his mind. But it was Linda's trembling voice on the phone that haunted him most. There's something about Daniel you don't know. He hadn't heard that tone in years, a mixture of fear and regret. That night he made up his mind. He had to see her face to face. The next morning he stood at the familiar door he hadn't walked through in over a decade. The paint was different, the flowers on the porch new, but the house smelled the same when Linda let him in, a blend of old wood, coffee, and lavender. She looked smaller than he remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes lined with fatigue. They exchanged stiff pleasantries before she led him into the living room, a space once full of family warmth, now crowded with silence. Richard didn't waste time. Linda, you said there's something I don't know. I need you to tell me straight. Daniel, he isn't just careless, is he? He's dangerous. Linda's face tightened. Don't say that. He's our son. He's made mistakes, but he isn't capable of what you're thinking. She clasped her hands, knuckles white. Richard could see the denial fighting against something darker in her expression. He leaned forward, voice raw. Henry almost died, Linda. Poison. From that bottle Daniel sent me. I gave it away and now Henry's in the hospital. This isn't about mistakes, this is about intent. If you know something, you can't keep it locked away anymore. Her breath caught. She shook her head, then pressed her hands to her face. For a long moment the room was filled with nothing but the ticking of the old mantel clock. Finally she lowered her hands and whispered, "He made me sign papers years ago. He said it was just for school loans, something with your assets, nothing serious. I didn't question it. I signed because he's my son and he looked so desperate." Richard's heart thudded. He gripped the armrest of his chair. "What papers?" Linda rose, shakily walked to a small cabinet and pulled out a worn envelope. She held it like it burned her fingers. Handing it to Richard, her voice trembled. "He made me sign this years ago. I didn't understand what it was for." Richard tore the flap open, scanning the documents inside. His eyes caught the legal jargon, references to property and a power of attorney clause that could shift control under certain conditions. It wasn't just a careless signature. It was a weapon disguised in paperwork, a blueprint for betrayal. His vision blurred with fury as he realized Linda unknowingly had placed the knife in their son's hand. She broke into sobs. "I thought I was helping him. He said he was drowning in debt, that he needed a co-signer. I believed him. God help me, I believed him. I never thought—" Her words dissolved into tears. Richard's voice cracked with both rage and grief. "You handed him the tools to destroy me." He slammed the papers onto the coffee table, his hands shaking. The betrayal wasn't just Daniel's anymore. It was woven through the very fabric of the family. Linda had been tricked, yes, but her mistake carried consequences neither of them could undo. He stood and paced the room, each step echoing against the hardwood. "My son wants me dead for money, and you, without knowing, gave him the keys to my life. How can I fight blood that sharpens itself against me?" His words left Linda trembling, unable to answer. For a moment, Richard's rage faltered into sorrow. He looked at Linda and saw not an accomplice but a mother shattered by the realization that her love had been weaponized. Yet the damage was done and the paper in his hands was proof. He stuffed the envelope into his coat pocket, his decision hardening. "This ends now. I won't let him carve me out of this world," Linda whispered through her tears. "Richard, please. He's still our son." Richard turned at the door, his face set in stone. A son doesn't try to bury his father for a paycheck. He stepped outside into the cold air, the envelope pressing against his chest like a brand. The betrayal was no longer hidden in shadows. It was ink on paper, signed by the hand of someone he had once trusted most. As he walked to his truck, one thought burned brighter than the rest. If Daniel had twisted Linda into helping him, who else had he pulled into his web? And how many more secrets were waiting to surface before the truth was finally laid bare? Richard left Linda's house, with the envelope heavy in his pocket and a storm heavier still in his chest. Her confession had torn away the last veil of innocence. Daniel hadn't stumbled into temptation. He had plotted, manipulated, and used his own mother to get closer to Richard's life and assets. The papers were proof, but proof wasn't enough. Richard needed to see his son's intent with his own eyes, hear it with his own ears. Only then could he bury any lingering doubt and prepare himself for the reckoning that was coming. 2 nights later, Richard sat in his truck across from a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. He knew from whispers and from Linda's strained words that Daniel had fallen deep into debt, trapped in the jaws of loan sharks who didn't forgive. If Daniel were to meet anyone connected to those debts, it would be here. The parking lot stretched wide in half-empty shadows pooling beneath flickering street lamps. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his breath fogging the windshield as he waited. At last, Daniel's car rolled in, headlights cutting through the dark. He parked near the back, far from the main entrance. Another vehicle soon joined him, an older sedan with tinted windows. Two men stepped out, broad-shouldered and hard-eyed, the kind of men who had no patience for missed payments. Richard slid lower in his seat, every muscle in his body taut, as his son stepped out to meet them. The conversation was hushed, carried on the night air in fragments. Richard strained to hear heart pounding in his ears. The men leaned close, one jabbing a finger into Daniel's chest. Daniel nodded nervously, his shoulders tight, his words tumbling out too fast. Then Richard caught it clear enough to freeze his blood. "Once he drinks it, we're clear." The words sliced through the darkness like a knife. They needed no explanation. Richard felt his chest constrict, his throat dry. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, the reality cutting deeper than any paper or suspicion could. The whiskey had never been a gift. It was a transaction, a payment in blood. He lifted his head, eyes fixed on his son, standing beneath the harsh glow of the street lamp, speaking of his father's death as casually as a debt to be settled. Rage coursed through Richard, hot and blinding, but beneath it pulsed a sorrow so profound it nearly broke him. He whispered into the silence of the cab, "Those words buried the last piece of hope I had." One of the men laughed, clapping Daniel on the back, and for a heartbeat Richard thought his son looked relieved. But then Daniel stiffened his head, snapping toward the lot as though he had sensed something. Richard ducked low, holding his breath as Daniel's eyes swept the shadows. For a moment their gazes nearly met across the distance, father and son separated not just by steel and glass, but by betrayal so thick it strangled the night. Richard stayed frozen until Daniel turned back to his companions. The meeting ended quickly, hands shaken, promises made. Daniel slid back into his car, his tires crunching gravel as he drove off into the night. Richard waited until the lot was empty again before daring to sit up, his chest aching from the tension. He knew he had risked everything being there, risked Daniel seeing him, risked tipping his hand too early. But the danger was worth it because now he had no doubt left. He started the truck, but his hands lingered on the wheel. Questions swirled like smoke in the cab. How much deeper had Daniel sunk? How many more steps had he already taken to erase his father from the picture? And what would he do if he discovered his plan had been overheard? Richard drove home under a sky heavy with clouds, headlights carving a narrow path through the dark. The sound of Daniel's words echoed again and again, a refrain that would not let him rest. He understood now that this was not only about money. It was about betrayal sharpened into intent, about debts paid in blood. And he knew he could no longer wait for someone else to stop his son. The time had come to act. Yet as Richard parked in his driveway, he caught sight of a figure lingering near his porch, half hidden in shadow. His stomach dropped, his hand tightening on the door handle. He had expected Daniel to act eventually, but was tonight already the night Richard barely slept after spotting the shadow near his porch. By the time morning light crept across his blinds, he had made a decision. If Daniel was willing to stalk him in the dark, then the only way forward was to flip the script. No more hiding, no more waiting. Richard would step out of the role of prey and force his son into the open. That very day he called Daniel with a steady voice and suggested they meet for coffee. To his surprise, Daniel agreed without hesitation, perhaps believing he still held the upper hand. The cafe was small, tucked on a quiet street where older couples lingered over breakfast and young professionals tapped on laptops. Richard chose a corner booth where he could see both the entrance and the exit. He arrived early, ordered black coffee, and rehearsed the words in his head. When Daniel finally walked in, his stride was confident, but his eyes carried the restless darting of a man on edge. He slid into the booth across from Richard, offering a stiff nod. Richard greeted him with a smile that felt foreign on his lips. "Good to see you, son. You know Henry really enjoyed that whiskey you sent." He let the words hang calm and casual, as though discussing the weather. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a thin smile. "Yeah, that's good to hear." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the effort it took to sound composed. Richard leaned in, lowering his voice to something conspiratorial. He liked it so much he kept the bottle close, said he wanted to save the rest for a special night. He watched carefully as Daniel's eyes flickered, his jaw tightening. Then the question came sharp and urgent, slipping out before Daniel could stop himself. "He still has it. He didn't finish it." Richard sipped his coffee, slowly savoring the moment. "Yeah," he said evenly, locking eyes with his son. "He kept it safe." The color drained from Daniel's face. His fingers twitched on the tabletop, tapping an erratic rhythm. For the first time, Richard saw not defiance or arrogance, but fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. In that instant, Richard felt a grim satisfaction bloom in his chest. This was no longer a question of doubt. The look on Daniel's face was confession enough. He wanted to lean across the table, shout at his son, demand to know why he had traded blood for money. But instead, Richard sat back, keeping his tone steady, his mask in place. Inside, his heart roared, but outwardly he remained calm because he wanted to savor the shift of power. Later he would admit to himself, "I wanted to see his face when the trap snapped shut." Daniel scrambled to recover, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. "Well, good. Henry always liked nice things. I'm glad he appreciated it." But his hands betrayed him, restless, fumbling with his napkin until it tore. He looked like a man cornered, though he tried to dress it up with casual words. Richard allowed the silence to stretch, then leaned forward. "Funny thing, though. Strange how one little bottle can stir up so much trouble, don't you think?" His words were soft, but the weight behind them made Daniel shift in his seat. The waitress arrived with refills, and for a moment Daniel seemed grateful for the interruption. But when she left, the tension settled back over the table like a heavy blanket. Daniel muttered something about work, about needing to go, but Richard waved it off. "No rush. I'm enjoying this talk." His eyes never left his son's face, watching every flinch, every twitch. By the time Daniel stood to leave, his composure had cracked beyond repair. Richard remained in his seat, calm as stone, watching him walk away with hurried steps. He had gained something important that morning, proof in the form of fear. Daniel's reaction told him everything he needed to know. Yet as Richard left the cafe, sliding into his truck with the bitter taste of coffee still in his mouth, he caught sight of a man across the street, one of the same men he had seen in the parking lot with Daniel days before. The man watched him with a cold, unreadable stare before turning and disappearing into an alley. Richard's stomach clenched. It wasn't just Daniel anymore. Others were circling, and the game he had started was about to turn deadly. Richard drove straight from the cafe to the police station, the memory of Daniel's pale face still burning in his mind. In the passenger seat lay the sealed evidence bag with the whiskey bottle, its amber liquid glinting faintly under the dashboard light. This time, he told himself, there would be no dismissals, no doubts. The truth was bottled, and once it was tested officially, no one could ignore it. He walked into the station with his jaw set, the weight of years of betrayal pressing down on his shoulders. At the front desk, he demanded to speak with someone from investigations. A young officer led him to a cramped office where Detective Harris sat behind a desk piled with folders. Richard placed the bag on the table with a deliberate motion. "Test this," he said, his voice low but firm. "It nearly killed Henry Miller. It came from my son." Harris raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, and slid the bottle toward himself. With a shrug, he called in a technician. The bottle disappeared into the lab next door, leaving Richard to sit in a chair that felt far too small for the burden he carried. Hours passed before the technician returned a folder in his hand. Harris opened it slowly, scanning the report. Then he looked up, his expression bland, almost bored. The results show traces of toxins. Poison, yes. Richard leaned forward, his pulse racing. At last, confirmation. But Harris held up a hand. Don't get ahead of yourself, it's not enough. Richard stared, his mouth dry. Not enough. You have a bottle of poisoned whiskey in your hand. Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. Mr. Walker, these cases are messy. Family disputes, inheritance issues, grudges. Poison could mean contamination, tampering after the fact. Unless we catch someone in the act or have a witness ready to testify, this isn't solid evidence. We can't move forward without solid evidence, Mr. Walker. His words dropped like stones, each syllable crushing Richard's fragile hope. The room tilted. Richard gripped the arms of his chair, fury rising like a storm tide. He had lived long enough to know what those words meant. They didn't want to get involved. To them, he was just another old man caught in family drama, better swept aside than pursued. The injustice seared him. His son had tried to kill him, and the law would do nothing. He stood slowly, his voice trembling with both rage and resolve. Then I'll find the evidence myself. When I bring it to you, you won't be able to look away. Harris only shrugged, already reaching for another folder, as if Richard's life and death struggle was a minor nuisance interrupting his day. Outside, the late afternoon sky was streaked with gray, the air thick with the promise of rain. Richard walked to his truck, the report still clutched in his fist. The words swam before his eyes, proof of poison that meant nothing in the hands of men too indifferent to act. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat there, chest heaving, the silence broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. He thought of Henry lying in a hospital bed, of Linda's trembling confession, of Daniel's fear at the cafe. Every piece of the puzzle pointed to the same grim truth, but without action. It was all smoke drifting into the wind. If the law would not deliver justice, then Richard would have to carve his own path to it. He started the engine, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. This was no longer about survival. It was about reclaiming control, about turning the hunter's gaze back on the predator. Somewhere in the shadows, his son was still moving pieces, still plotting, still confident the world would shield him. Richard's lips curled into a hard, thin line. Not anymore. As he pulled out of the lot, headlights cut across his windshield. A dark sedan lingered across the street, engine idling, its windows too tinted to reveal who sat inside. Richard slowed, his heart thumping. Was it the same car he had seen at the parking lot with Daniel's creditors? The engine revved once, then the sedan slipped into traffic, vanishing into the night. Richard gritted his teeth. He was being watched, and if he faltered now, he knew he wouldn't get another chance. Richard knew the police would never move without undeniable proof. The poisoned whiskey, the debt, the gossip, none of it was enough. If Daniel was to be exposed, it had to be from Daniel's own mouth. That meant baiting him into a place where fear would crack his composure and every word would be caught on tape. Richard prepared carefully, slipping a recorder into his pocket, a small camera hidden in the lining of his jacket. This time he would not walk into the lion's den unarmed. He lured Daniel with a message that was simple but sharp enough to provoke, "Meet me tonight. The whiskey isn't gone and you need to hear what I know." Hours later, Richard's truck rolled into the dark lot of an abandoned garage on the edge of town. A place that smelled of rust and oil, with shadows thick enough to swallow secrets. The police, at last convinced by the lab results and the threats Richard had overheard, had agreed to wait in silence outside, hidden among the trees with their radios muted. The trap was set. Daniel arrived late, headlights sweeping across cracked concrete before flicking off. He stepped inside, his face pale in the dim light of Richard's lantern. "Why here?" he asked, voice tight eyes, dark and blank. Richard folded his arms, keeping his tone calm. "Because no one can interrupt us. We need to talk about Henry. About that bottle." Daniel's mask slipped almost instantly. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, and sweat beaded along his hairline. "You don't understand," he muttered, pacing. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." Richard let the silence draw out until Daniel's nerves began to fray. Then he said softly, "Funny choice of words. Supposed to happen." Care to explain? Daniel spun on him, eyes wild. He should have been gone by now. The words tore out before he could stop them, echoing in the hollow garage. For a moment, Daniel froze, realizing what he'd just admitted. Richard's heart hammered as the recorder in his pocket captured every syllable. Trying to backpedal, Daniel's voice cracked. "I never meant for it to happen this way, but you left me no choice." His hands trembled, his breath uneven. He looked less like a man and more like a cornered animal, lashing out with words that betrayed him further. From the shadows outside, Richard knew the officers were hearing everything through the wire he had given them. Every confession, every slip of the tongue was traveling straight into their radios. The evidence no longer sat in a bottle of whiskey. It spilled from Daniel's own mouth, irreversible and undeniable. But just as Richard felt the weight of vindication rise in his chest, Daniel's eyes flicked toward his jacket. A sharp glimmer of realization crossed his face. He had seen the outline of the hidden camera, the faint glow that betrayed it. His expression twisted into fury. "You set me up," he hissed, stepping closer. Fists clenched. Richard's pulse surged. The trap had worked, but the predator was not finished fighting. The line between exposure and violence had thinned to a thread. And Richard braced himself as Daniel closed the distance, his voice rising with rage and desperation. Daniel lunged toward Richard, fury twisting his face, but the shout of officers shattered the moment. Floodlights cut through the darkness of the garage, red and blue lights flashing against the rusted walls. Police poured in with weapons drawn, commanding Daniel to step back. He froze, chest-heaving eyes darting between his father and the officers. Then rough hands seized him, pulling his arms behind his back as the cuffs snapped into place. Richard stood rigid, his breath ragged as Daniel struggled against the hold. His son's voice rose in a guttural scream, each word tearing through the cold night. "You were never my father. Never." The venom in the shout hit Richard harder than any blade could. For a moment, he almost collapsed under the weight of it. Even as Daniel was dragged toward the patrol car, the words hung in the air, a cruel echo that no arrest could silence. The night was bitterly cold, steam curling from mouths as officers moved swiftly, securing the scene. Richard wrapped his coat tighter, trying to steady himself. Then a voice broke through the chaos, unexpected, ragged with age. "Richard, stop this. Don't destroy him." Richard turned stunned to see Henry leaning heavily on a cane face, pale under the flashing lights. He had come despite his fragile health, pulled into the scene by some unseen tether. Henry's eyes brimmed with something between guilt and desperation. "It isn't all his fault," he said, voice cracking. "I planted this seed long ago." Richard's stomach twisted, disbelief mixing with rage. "What are you talking about?" Henry looked past Richard to Daniel, who was now slumped against the squad car. His fury replaced with hollow silence. Then Henry's voice dropped, weighted with confession. "I made him believe he deserved everything of yours. I told him you'd stolen from him. Stolen his childhood, his future. I twisted the knife until he believed the only way to claim his worth was through your end." His cane rattled against the pavement as he trembled. "I never thought he'd go this far, but I pushed him there." Richard felt the ground sway beneath him. Betrayal from his son was one wound, but this, the revelation that Henry had been the puppeteer, was another cut altogether deeper and more poisonous. Memories came flooding back, Henry's mocking words at the barbecue, his subtle undermining over the years, the way Daniel's resentment had hardened. Richard had thought Daniel's bitterness was born from the divorce, from distance. But no, it had been fed, nurtured, weaponized. He staggered closer, his voice raw. All these years. You made him hate me. You turned my own blood against me. Henry flinched, his mouth working as though to find justification. But no words could soften the blow. The police shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of revelations that went far beyond a poisoned bottle. Daniel let out a broken laugh from where he sat in cuffs, bitter and empty. You think I dreamed this up alone? He taught me every word of it. He made me see you as the enemy. His eyes, red and hollow, flicked between Richard and Henry, and I believed him. For Richard, the world spun between grief and fury. He had lost his son long before the whiskey, long before the poison. The theft had been invisible, stolen in whispers by a man who should have been a source of strength. Now, under the flashing lights, the truth stood naked. Betrayal was not born in one man, but in generations feeding off each other's wounds. An officer pulled Henry gently aside, cautioning him to rest. But Richard's eyes locked on him with unspoken fire. This was no longer just a son's crime. It was a legacy of venom passed down like inheritance. And for the first time, Richard wondered if exposing Daniel was only half the battle. The greater enemy might still be standing before him, cane in hand. Smile trembling under the weight of guilt, the patrol car door slammed shut on Daniel, but Richard's fists clenched. The night had delivered one truth, but it had also opened a darker path. If Henry had manipulated Daniel all these years, then the real reckoning had only just begun. The night Daniel was taken away, the flashing red and blue lights still clung to Richard's vision long after the patrol cars were gone. The neighborhood had gone quiet again, leaving him standing in the chill of the driveway, watching his breath drift into the dark. By the time he stepped back inside his house, the silence felt heavier than ever. It was the kind of silence that carried both relief and sorrow, victory and loss. News came quickly over the following day. Daniel was being held without bail, the evidence of his confession too damning to ignore. The law had finally acted, though it was too late to mend the rift that poison and betrayal had carved. Henry survived his ordeal but walked with a cane, his reputation scarred by Richard's knowledge of the truth. To the outside world he remained the proud patriarch, but Richard knew what lay beneath the whispering poison that had seeped into Daniel's heart. That knowledge was a weight Henry would carry until his last breath. Richard spent most of his days in the quiet of his home. The bottle of whiskey, now locked away in an evidence room, was gone, but its shadow lingered. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the wood grain, tracing the lines as though they were roads leading back through his life. Every choice, every absence, every word left unsaid seemed to converge on this bitter ending. He thought of Daniel as a boy, stubborn but eager, and wondered when exactly the path had twisted. Was it the divorce? Was it Henry's cruel whispering? Or was it something in himself, a failure planted long before one evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the room in gold, Richard finally spoke aloud, his voice trembling but firm. Family should be a shield, mine became the blade. The words echoed in the stillness, stark and final. They were not just an indictment of Daniel, but of the generations that had sown spite and envy where trust should have been. There was a measure of justice in knowing Daniel would face the law. There was grim satisfaction in watching Henry's mask slip, exposing the rot beneath his authority. Yet none of it brought peace. Richard understood that some wounds did not close, that some betrayals left scars deeper than justice could reach. He felt both vindicated and hollow, standing at the crossroads of revenge and grief. As he sat in the dim light of his living room, the house empty but for the hum of the old refrigerator, Richard's thoughts turned outward. What did family mean when blood could turn against blood? What value did loyalty hold when it could be twisted by greed, by envy, by the whispers of another man? He wondered if his story was unique or if others carried similar wounds behind closed doors, secrets festering in silence. He leaned back, letting the quiet stretch, knowing there were no easy answers. Justice had come, but so had loss. The law had taken his son, but hatred had taken him long before. For all the years he had worked and sacrificed, this was the inheritance he was left with: truth, bitter and unrelenting. Richard closed his eyes, whispering one final thought to the empty room. A thought meant as much for the world as for himself. When the people you love become the ones who betray you, do you still call them family? Or do you let them go? And with that question hanging in the air, he sat in the deepening dusk, leaving it unanswered, leaving it for others to wrestle with as the shadows slowly claimed the last of the light. If you've stayed with me until now, you've seen how a simple bottle of whiskey shattered the fragile bonds of a family. A son poisoned by greed, a father torn between love and survival, and an old rivalry that stretched across generations. In the end, justice may have spoken, but the wounds of betrayal never truly fade. Family should protect us, not destroy us. Yet sometimes the very people who carry our blood become the ones who cut the deepest. Richard's story forces us to ask, when betrayal comes from inside your own home, is justice enough to heal? Or does the scar remain forever? Thank you for watching and sharing this journey with me. If stories like this move you, if they make you reflect on the meaning of loyalty and love, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here, and I leave you with this question in your eyes: can blood ever outweigh betrayal? Or once the trust is broken, is family lost for good?